Way before the Ponzi's and the Madoffs, before insider trading and corporate sneak deals, all crime has a history. Most crime has been changed or twisted as society has changed, but the bare bone elements have been there for ages. Various types of crimes, like the old school biblical crimes, murder, thievery, and the like, those crimes definitely would get you arrested and probably sentenced to death back in the day. The more intriguing aspects of the history of crime are not the ones that make sense, I guess, but the actual origins of ones that we feel aren't that historic. Things like tax evasion, embezzlement, fraud, typical scamming, we like to think aren't really that old. We can see news stories of some people doing this same thing. Just as we see news stories of people committing the oldest crimes, they too have an origin story. The first crimes have been lost to the sands of time, but what we can find are the earliest examples of what we call white-collar crime in today's world, which is exactly what we are going to be looking at today. The history of the most notorious types of nonviolent crimes, the origins of some of the ways people have ruined the lives of their fellow human, on another episode of The Remedial Scholar.
That's ancient history.
I feel I was denied critical, need to know information. Belongs in a museum, bro. Stop skipping your remedial class.
Well, look what the cat dragged in. Welcome back, baby birds, to The Remedial Scholar. I am your host, Levi, and I'm happy to be here with you. Happy for you to be joining me. Thank you for joining us on another episode. If you're new, I hope you enjoy this show. This should be an interesting one. If you're a returning listener, I'm sorry I've abandoned you for so long. I have just finished my degree, so I'm going to have a lot more free time to be working back on the show. If I'm being honest, it might have been a little bit too much handling 2 podcasts and a job and a college pursuit and 2 jobs at the same time. My bad. Might have overbooked myself, but you know what? We're here, and I just didn't want to put out any, half-assed stories, if as it were. But I also didn't want to, just straight up steal anything. So, if you're a Time Suck listener, you will understand that reference. Hopefully, maybe. If not, don't listen to the Human Monsters podcast. Either way, I'm not here to slander people, but I am here to create a very wonderful and hopefully interesting episode for you. This episode is actually a listener suggestion, so if you enjoy this and you want to hear about something history adjacent, you too can get your suggestions added to the catalog. And what a fun feeling. I feel like this episode suggestion, because it does the thing that I love to do on this show, which is to go through decades of history and hit major moments as we go through them. I think some of the more successful episodes, in my opinion, in terms of how I felt about them, like the War Dogs episode and more recently the art vandalism episode, to be specific, those episodes kind of do that. They progress through time, not focusing on one specific thing, but like a broad topic that hits a bunch of different timelines, which I think is cool. And, it's also, just going back to the fact that it's a listener suggestion episode, very interesting that, some of these suggestions are not what you would expect. Some people think, oh, if I need a suggestion episode, it's got to be one of the biography ones, like Marie Antoinette or MLK or something like that. But this one was literally pitched as, I would love to hear about white-collar crimes in ancient history. That's it. It's vague, but it's also kind of interesting because it's not something you typically think of. You think of ancient times, you think of wars, chariots, bows and arrows, swords, and all that. And this is like a whole different landscape. And I think it kind of tells a little bit better of a picture of how life went back then. So very excited. With all that being said, let's kind of get into what this topic really means. As mentioned in the prelude, white-collar crime is a modern term to describe nonviolent, financial-based crimes, which is nonviolent or these crimes are deceptive in nature and usually driven by a desire to, accrue power or money. Looking at that definition with a historical lens, it is easy to see that this is undoubtedly has been going on in the ancient, like there's no way it wasn't. But how far back is the question? Well, first we should figure out what white collar crime is. First coined in 1939 by Professor Edwin Hardin Sutherland, describing what types of crimes would be committed by what types of people. White collar crime was chosen to call attention to the fact that people committing financial crimes are typically of suit wearing varieties, at that point in time. That narrows the scope of what I want to discuss here, which is that these crimes are financial in nature and most of the time resulted in little to no personal injury. Things like tax evasion, fraud, extortion, bribery, embezzlement, and things like traditional scamming people from their money. So with that, let's get into it. Picture this. You're living in ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, nestled between the mighty Tigris and Euphrates River. Your day begins at dawn as the sun rises over the landscape, crisscrossed by irrigation canals that bring life-giving water to your fields. You're a farmer in one of the bustling city-states, perhaps Uruk or Ur, and your daily life is governed by the rhythmic cycles of planting and harvest. As you walk through the fields checking the growth of barley and wheat, you pass by laborers who are just as busy as you, tending to the crops, repairing canals, different things. The air is filled with distant sounds of the city, the clatter of looms, the clang of blacksmith's hammer, and the calls of traders in the market. Returning from the fields in the heat of the day, you meander through narrow, winding streets lined with homes made from sun-dried mud and bricks. The smell of baking bread wafts from doorways. Children play in the dusty lanes under the watchful eyes of their mother. In the city center, Grand Ziggurat towers over the homes and the marketplace. Its massive steps lead to a temple where priests perform daily rituals to appease the city's patron deity, ensuring prosperity, protection for all. Occasionally, you bring offerings to the temple, hoping bountiful harvest or good health for your family. You pass through the marketplace, which is a hive of activity where you barter your produce for other necessities. Here, traders from distant lands bring exotic goods such as spices, metals, and textiles that are not, naturally occurring in your village or town. The market is also a place for news, where tales of neighboring city-states and caravans from across the mountains stir your imagination with stories of faraway places. You're in the bustling city-state of Ur around 1750 BCE. The streets are alive with these merchants and townspeople, and all of the trade and everyday chatter fills the air. You're a merchant yourself, and today you are particularly aggrieved as you stride purposefully towards the home of Ea-Nasir, a man known for his copper trading and, unfortunately, his dubious business practices. As you reach his house, you can see other frustrated patrons, leaving their expressions sour. Taking a deep breath, you enter the dimly lit room where Ea-Nasir conducts his business. Stacks of clay tablets are piled haphazardly around the room, evidence of many deals, both completed and pending. Ea-Nasir looks at you from his work, barely concealing his annoyance. "What is it now?" he demands, his tone dismissive. You hold up a small, poorly made copper ingot, the cause of your frustration. "Ea-Nasir, this is not what I paid for," you assert firmly, trying to keep your temper in check. "This copper is substandard and you know it. It is full of slag and completely unusable for my purposes." Ea-Nasir's face hardens and he slowly rises from his seat. "That copper came from the best mines, and you would accuse me of cheating you?" he retorts, his voice rising slightly. "You must be mistaken. My copper is the finest in Ur." Unfazed, you place the ingot on the table with a thud. "I am not mistaken. I've traded enough to know when the copper is bad. We had an agreement, Ea-Nasir, and you have not honored it. I demand a refund or a replacement with the quality I was promised." The room grows tense as Ea-Nasir leans closer, his eyes narrowing. "You dare insult my integrity? I do not give refunds or replacements. You take what you are given and pay what you owe." Your hands clench in frustration, but you maintain your composure. "I am owed the quality I paid for, Ea-Nasir. Do not think I will walk away from this. I will bring this matter to the temple court if I must." He scoffs, turning away dismissively. "Go then, and see if the priest will favor a complainer over a well-known merchant like myself." With one last stern look, you snatch up the ingot and exit. Determined to seek justice, as you step back into the sunlight, your resolve hardens. The fairness and integrity of the trade in Ur are at stake, and you will not let this matter rest. This fictional exchange, it is part and parcel to the trials and tribulations faced by patrons of Ea-Nasir, whose real-life complaints have been immortalized in a famous cuneiform tablet, which expresses dissatisfaction with the quality of copper delivered and the general conduct of the merchant himself, a glimpse into the commercial disputes and customer service challenges in ancient Mesopotamia. Ea-Nasir had many complaints about him, and there are plenty of tablets to prove it, which is kind of wild to me. Millennia before Nigerian princes emailed us about our potential fortune, this guy was scamming people by charging premium prices for poor products. Too many P's in that sentence. This is why he has been dubbed Ea-Nasir, a play on the video game company Electronic Arts, Ea-Nasir. It's in the copper. Not gonna lie, stole that line from a comment on Reddit. I want to be as transparent about where I borrow things from. He could not have been the only one to have scammed people, but this is probably the most famous in my mind. There's a Facebook role-playing group where everyone in it role-plays in the comments on posts as someone from the Bronze Age, and it's always full of Ea-Nasir memes, which I do love. So, scamming people, it's been around forever, which probably doesn't surprise anyone. We even talked about scammers in the first episode, in the War Dogs episode. I talked about the Lydians and their Lydian stone, which was used to tell fake gold from real gold. It implies that they had been scammed before. Scamming has been around as long as people have, I imagine. And so is bribery. As long as people have been trying to leverage good for something they need or want to increase whatever metric they're trying to increase, bribery has been there. As long as there has been someone in power or an authority figure and people needing their leniency or someone trying to gain favor, bribes have been there. The example I want to talk about is kind of interesting comparatively. It comes from the ancient Greek historian Herodotus. We have heard from Herodotus a few times, and he's a decent source for some ancient Greek shenanigans, albeit, a little bit of an asterisk. Herodotus did write about these events after they happened, but here's the thing. With these very mundane type of, things, I'm gonna go ahead, it's one thing for him to write about, the outcomes of some crazy battle and a god in the favor of something. That's one thing, but for him to, write about general goings-on, pretty interesting, because it's why, there's no real reason to embellish that story that much, I guess, if it makes sense. So, anyway, bribery is one of the most common forms of monetary crimes. Maybe not, but it feels accurate. Hard to tell the exact number of things like this because, they are supposed to be hidden. So we only know about the failed bribe attempts or the attempts that the outcome couldn't be changed by this knowledge, or if somebody just learned about it and wrote about it further down the road, like Herodotus. Bribing could be simple: grease a little palms and get what you're asking for, pay a professional athlete to throw a game, give a valet 20 and they give you a lead on that unique looking criminal you've been searching for because he killed your ex-wife. No. Donate to a school and your shithead kid gets in. Typical stuff. What is not so typical is the practice by ancient Greeks of bribing oracles, most notably the oracle at Delphi, or Delphi, whatever, the most famous ones. It turns out that it was kind of typical. It was just not something that I have expected. But then again, it is ancient Greece. They have very loose morals. That's how you kind of did anything back then. You paid the local dignitary, you paid the temple, which means you essentially paid the gods. They call it tribute, but let's be real, it is kind of a bribe, right? It was general practice that leaders and prominent nobles alike would seek the advice of the oracle, who was often a young woman who inhaled a variety of fumes and gave a divination about where they should attack or who they should form an alliance with, that kind of thing. Because the oracle worked on behalf of Apollo, or on behalf of his word, it would seem natural that giving him gifts through this hallucinating contortionist would earn his favor. The problem is that, as we know it, he does not exist. So, bribing this lady only gave you the kind of imaginary confidence that it might work. It is also important to know that they did not give outcomes like in the movies, like in 300. I know that's based on a comic book, but he goes to her and she's like, you're gonna die, whatever, you're gonna die in 7 days. No, that's a different movie. But essentially, those kinds of prophecies she didn't deal in. She would either instruct, kind of give her guidance on what their actions should be without giving them direct outcome, otherwise affirm choices made by the people who would come seek their advice in the first place. And how can you determine a bribe from a gift to a priest who receives gifts simply for the privilege of admitting to see the oracle? Well, I think, aside from my statement that they kind of are all bribes, if you look at it that way, is that the size of the gift is a little telling. The intent of that is also pretty important. If you want to defeat an enemy kingdom for power and control, you want the gods to be in your favor. That seems like a bribe to me. The oracle, otherwise known as the Pythia, reminds me a lot of Nostradamus in the way that her advice is often vague, and thus she needs responsibility, or sheds responsibility for when things go wrong. For instance, when the Lydian king Croesus sought the Pythia for her divine interpretation on what to do in regards to a potential war with the Persians in the 6th century BCE, it is said that she indicated that there would be an empire that would fall. Now, if she told me this, I would not go ahead with it. I am far too much of an overthinker to decide on military action based on that slim bit of commentary, but Croesus doesn't. He ain't scared, so he takes his army and fights the Persians. This does not go well, and in the Battle of Thymbria, Croesus is defeated after a 2-week-long siege by at the capital of Sardis. After the Persians break through the capital, Croesus is captured and his territory surrendered. Croesus is also the king who succeeded Alyattes, the king in Lydia, who used dogs to defend his city. So that's a little fun remedial scholar trivia for you. 2 references to the War Dogs episode in one episode. That's pretty neat. Maybe, I don't know. Or it's just tooting my own horn a little too much. Anyway, Croesus's bribery did not bode well for him in his attempt against the enemy force, but the next example of bribery does end positively for the briber. A historical family known as the Achaemenids. Oh, nope, that's not how you say it. Achaemenids. There we go. So anyway, this next bit, quite interesting, has a little bit of layers. So the Achaemenids, or Achaemenidae, if you will, were a political noble family in Athens who had the reputation that they were cursed. Some simple, traditional marrying into another noble family to secure a good bloodline and political favor gone wrong led to many years of bad news for them. They would be pushed out of conversation or even town because of their methods, beliefs, or the curse itself. In this case, they were exiled by Pisistratidae, who is a noble, it's a noble family stemming from Pisistratus, which is a hilarious name, and he ruled in Athens during the mid-6th century BCE. This guy's also pretty impressive as a ruler in many of the articles I found, called a tyrant. Not really what we know as of a tyrant now. Tyrant back then is kind of just a leader who wields their power directly, like doesn't have a council that directs them, or they have to work around different legal mumbo jumbo, if you will. So anyway, he seemed to not jive with the other with the noble classes and kind of fought for the lower classes, which is kind of cool. He cared about the arts and the culture, being a prominent supporter of making copies of the Iliad and the Odyssey. So if you failed English in high school, you might not like him. He was also a general, fighting in places like Marathon, just a couple decades before the actual Battle of Marathon, which, is celebrated to this day by weirdos replicating annually to bully the poor guy who made that run one time and then died. Super rude. I would also like to take this time to dispel the rumor that he died after running the 26.2 miles. He died after running 155 miles in a day and a half. So I'm going to need to see a lot more David Goggins inspired people running this summer, because a marathon is really not that crazy. Put some respect on my man, Pheidippides. Yeah, Pheidippides? I don't know. Put some respect on his name, even though I can't pronounce it. Anyway, back to Pisistratus, easy name to spell when you just think about piss. He would hold office as the tyrant 3 separate times, each time clawing his way back in. At 39, he first came to office and then was kicked out and exiled, and then he returned 2 years later, ruled for 3 years, then banished once more before taking power for his third and final time in 546 BCE. This would last until his death in 528, between 528 and 527 BCE. During his several tenures, I mentioned he butted heads with the aristocracy. One group that I mentioned, the Achaemenids, or Achaemenidae, nailed it, who, also, if you remember, had their fair share of exiles and political infighting within Athens. After the death of Pisistratus, his sons took control and essentially kept his legacy going. They didn't really change much of his laws at first. Here's where it gets interesting. Pisistratus' sons, Hippias and Hipparchus, whatever, share the tyranny, right? And kind of like a dual-headed spear. According to Herodotus, Hipparchus was then assassinated in a plot by two lovers, Harmodius and Aristogiton. We're gonna go with that. And why did these two fellows assassinate half of the pair of tyrants who ruled the relatively pretty mellowly? Because Hipparchus tried to bed Harmodius, and when he was rejected, he then insulted Harmodius' sister, which is way worse than it is today. He brought her to a festival that was honored, to honor unmarried women, and then publicly disqualified her because she was not a virgin. So, pretty douchey of a move. Following the death of his brother, Hippias went off the deep end, transforming the historical sense of the word tyrant to the modern definition real quick. He was said to have become very cruel, and what's worse is that there were rumblings that he was secretly plotting with the Persians, the Greeks' arch nemesis. The Achaemenids found out, and now we're focused on kind of getting rid of this successor. They had leveraged their rebuilding of the temple at Delphi, which was damaged a few years earlier, into a coordinated effort to have the Pythia tell the Spartans, who consulted her judgment, that they should attack Athens and dethrone the tyrant. So, this is the bribe. They built a fancy new Parian marble temple for the priests and the oracle, and in return, just give some info to the Spartans when they come up. No biggie. So, once the Spartans dethroned Hippias in 510 BCE and forced him into exile for the sake of his children, that was the whole thing. They kidnapped his kids, and then he's like, don't do it, and they're like, get out of town then. Pretty sure that's how it happened. They probably even spoke modern English. So anyway, once that happened, there was a power vacuum. The Spartans had installed their own head of state, but he wouldn't last for very long. He kept the more tyrannical thing going, while members of the Achaemenidae, Cleisthenes, would garner a lot of public favor by championing a democratic system. This is despite the family curse that even the Spartans had heard about and were like, nah, I don't know, you can't be a leader, you guys are cursed, dude. Which is hilarious how funny it was back then. Eventually, Cleisthenes returned and instituted a more democratic system, so pretty cool, right? Power was divided by 10 different tribes and a 500-member council known as the Bull, to which the tenet of them was to advise according to the laws what was best for the people, which I find to be pretty neat. His opponent, Hippias of the Pisistratae, which was, in bed with the Persians and joined forces with King Darius I. In a full circle moment, Hippias had advised Darius to attack Athens for not accepting his return as tyrants. The location of the first battle, Marathon. Hippias died, not in battle, as he was with Darius, who did not directly engage, but he did die on the way back to Persia. So, pretty long-winded for bribery, but I thought the story was far too interesting not to tell in full. I could have just simply kept it short and sweet, but it's too late for all that. So, pretty interesting how a family who opposed a tyrannical rule and instead favored a more democratic approach used some real slick political moves to get their way. Some real House of Cards action, bribing a supposed mouthpiece of a god to sway the opinions of a foreign kingdom, to then dispose of a tyrant on the off chance that it might work out for you. That's a long shot if I've ever heard one. Alright, so that kind of settles bribery. We got a solid couple examples for bribery back in the day. I'd like to turn your attention towards the act of fraud. Fraud, at its core, is simply deceptive and criminal actions to increase your own financial or personal gain. Paraphrased from the Oxford Dictionary, the official dictionary of the NFL. No, I don't know why I said that. Anyway, fraud, typically of the insurance varieties, involves property that has been reported as missing, damaged, or something along those lines, and then the party is reimbursed, but it turns out the property was never missing or damaged. You see a lot of movies where a business burns down and then the owner tries to recoup the money, and it turns out they had the place insured twice for the value or something like that. Fraud in the ancient world might be something similar to what Ea-Nasir was doing, or even merchants secretly cheating the scales while measuring goods to trade with. The earliest documented cases of fraud comes from a couple centuries after the last example in 300 BCE. As we have discussed at length in other episodes, it should be no surprise that in 300 BCE, people in the Mediterranean made their money kind of by way of boat or ship, often traveling into this large body of water to fish or sail to another island, transport goods back and forth. One thing you could do if you had a vessel was essentially a mortgage. You could borrow money from a creditor and use the boat as collateral, but it would also still be able to be used. You could use said vessel to earn money. It would be like if for some reason a mailman used his mail truck as collateral for a pawn shop loan, and then the pawn shop was like, hey, we know that's how you make your money, so go ahead and keep using the mail truck. Not really a flawless example, but it is what it is. Back in these days, you would have essentially just said, hey, I have ship, as you can see, it's behind me. I use it to earn money, and I need some of that money kind of fronted because I'm going to take a voyage, but I don't have enough money to pay crew or whatever the heck it was. This is known as bottomry, and it was very common in those days and continued all the way up until like the 19th century. One of the main things to consider when regarding bottomry is that if something happened to the vessel, the loan could not be recouped, so the creditor lost out on the money in the ship or cargo that was used. So not great for the creditor, but it's, you don't want to lose the ship. That's the whole point of sailing. Like the step 1 of sailing is to not lose the ship. Step 2 is to get to where you're going. Like pretty straightforward. So in 300 BCE, a man named Hegestratus took out some bottomry on his cargo and ship. The creditor fully expected to be paid back as soon as he returned from his run. Unbeknownst to the creditor, Hegestratus was working with another man named Xenosthemis, pretty cool name, and together they created a plan in which they would unload the shipment from the boat and hide it, and then they would go out, sink the ship, return to port, and let the creditor know, and then have the loan marked off, and they would retrieve the stashed cargo, sell it privately. Seems like a really simple plan, and with the lack of security cameras back then, it seems like it could be easy to get away with. One thing I'm just thinking about now, and I didn't put this in my notes or anything, but like, how expensive were ships? Like, how it doesn't say how big this loan was, but like, if you sunk your ship and it was less than the loan and less than what you would better hope you make a ton on that grain, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, in a translation of Demosthenes' writings on the subject, it is found that Zimothemis was in cahoots with Hegestratus, or he might have just been a co-conspirator who kind of took over after the fact. You'll find out what that means in a second. Translation is a little funky, and it was done in 1934, so who knows? What we do know is that after removing the grain from the ship while at sea, Hegestratus began to cut a hole in the ship. His crew figured out what was happening, and chase ensued. He tried to escape, running for a smaller, like, lifeboat type thing, and as he ran for it's terrible, but it's funny. As he ran for the lifeboat, he jumped and missed it and landed squarely in the dark water and drowned. Like, he just fell down. So after his death, the crew tries to claim the cargo that he had left behind. They actually saved the ship, sail it into port. They find out where the cargo was and all kind of claim it. But because of doing this, they all kind of get charged with a conspiracy, so not great. Luckily for whoever granted the bottomry, because, the ship is saved, they got their money back, and it doesn't say what happened to the cargo, but I kind of hope they gave it to the creditor too, just for, like, the repairs needed on the ship and also general stress of the situation. Anyway, pretty fun. Way more creativity than I originally imagined could have went into this. My first reading of the story was a couple sentences of like some random blogs, and there's not a whole lot of information, so I had to do some like real searching to find that Demosthenes translation, and I'm really glad I did because it adds a lot of context to what's going on. So anyway, moving from ancient Greece, the next one is a bit different thing. It's a few different things, actually. I would argue that it's not also fully white-collar crime, but it is organized crime, and that is super interesting to me. So it also comes from, the home of the most notorious of organized crime organizations, Italy. That's right, babes, we are in ancient Rome once again, and I want to talk about fires. And you might think that those thoughts are disconnected, but I assure you, it will all make sense in a minute. The other thought you might have is, hey, Rome, really love their marble buildings and mosaic tiles and whatnot. How does that stuff catch on fire if it's not wood then? The answer is, it does not very well. But what a lot of history books and movies neglect to show about the ancient world is that wood existed, and they actually used it a lot. The issue is that a lot of ruins don't, like, don't show it because the wood deteriorates and breaks down over time, and so we assume things looked one way and typically had more interest, like it had a more interesting and functional look about them in reality. How does this connect? Well, did all the wood burn up in one massive ancient fire? Not really, but I wanted to paint a picture of the flammable materials in the ancient world. So with that out of the way, fires in big cities are pretty common and not that surprising. What is also not surprising is that there were firefighting forces as far back as ancient Egypt. They didn't all have Dalmatians though. In ancient Rome, it wasn't until a man named Marcus Licinius Crassus that there were actual firefighters. Crassus was a very wealthy man, and he did not become rich by being overly nice. Crassus is probably best known as 1/3 of the triumvirate, which also had a little-known man named Julius Caesar on board. So the fact that he started a fire brigade should cause some pause. Another part of this is that the brigade was made up of some 500 slaves. So, it is par for the course for the times, but still, what is stated is that he would have these slaves ready around town, and when someone would ring the bells, the alarm bells that there's a fire, they would all rush to the fire. Sounds simple enough, but here's the tricky part. According to our good friend Plutarch, Crassus would show up and hold the fire brigade from making any heroic efforts, and instead find the owner of said home or land, and potentially even the neighboring buildings, and begin to make offers on the property. He would then offer less and less money as the fires would consume the building, and as the person's personal effects are burning, their private stash of popcorn just blasting up inside. The desperate to take the money and hope to buy a cheaper home and save their belongings. Others would hold out, and then when all hope was lost, they would just buy the ash. Crassus would just buy the ground underneath the ash. This is textbook extortion, and because of this, it is not a true white-collar crime because there were direct victims who lost property, but also nobody died necessarily, or that we know of. But it's still pretty fascinating, and I wanted to include it because of that. So from Rome to the Dark Ages, there's more fraud to be found. The range of what fraud was used for is pretty vast. In some cases, it was simple as maintaining borders for some monasteries. This was the case at Crowland Abbey, long established with its roots dating back to the 8th century. This monastery served as a pillar of the community of what is now Lincolnshire. Shortly after it was established, those damn pesky Danes came through and slaughtered most of the people in the area. There's even a relic from that time in the newer version of the abbey. One abbot named Theodore was killed at this time, and his skull is in storage there. So what does this have to do with fraud? Is the skull fake? No. What is fraudulent are manuscripts supposedly written by an 11th century monk named Ingolf. These works were written to establish longer lineage and proof of borders so that the nearby Spalding Abbey could not encroach on the lands of Croyland. The issue is that these weren't actually written by Ingolf in the 11th century, and they were in fact written in the 14th century by some other guy because Ingolf was not alive. This was actually kind of a traditional practice of fraud to maintain property lines. Monasteries would actually expand their reaches as far as they could until landowners kind of pushed back, and then they would either provide a historical document stating that their land reached so far, or they would kind of forego any advancement. They're just not worth the fight, whatever. Other practices of forgery or document fraud go further back. One of the most famous is called the Donation of Constantine, which is a supposed 4th century CE document that Constantine drafted and transferred his power to the Pope. This included his power over the Western Roman Empire, which hopefully I don't need to explain is, this document's not super real, because the supposed documents were not crafted in the 4th century, but instead much later in either the 8th or 9th century. A priest in the 1400s named Lorenzo Valla is credited with proving it to be a false document, which is very impressive given that he was a Catholic priest, and this is, like an affront to the man in the big hat. So, fraud was so rampant in the Middle Ages that there was a preference on what type of material legal documents were written on. The textiles at the time were easy to forge or tweak, and to the untrained eye, hard to detect, and the Middle Ages was full of untrained eyes. This caused the bulk of important things to be cataloged on sheepskin parchments, as it was harder to forge and easier to tell if it had been. It's like a medieval version of watermarks. Another sheep-related version of fraud in the Middle Ages was that there was a practice among shepherds that they would sell the sheep or lambskin on their own but only like a partial amount. By selling the finest of their skins for the most they could get, they pocketed extra money and then used that money to buy lesser skins from somebody else to give to the lord of their land. The profit was otherwise hidden for themselves, which I fully support wholeheartedly. I found a whole article on sheep-related fraud, which I think is fantastic. Other examples include soaking the skin right after to make it appear as if the lamb had died of a disease called murrain. This would enable the farmer to keep the meat or sell it elsewhere, similar to how they would just sell the skins before payment to the Lord. The last one is like a little like fudging the numbers a little bit. If two shepherds live near one another and use the same type of brand, you could steal sheep from the other shepherd, quote steal, and then sell them, and then later you just give 3 sheep to the other guy, and it's like a cash advance almost on the sheep, and the lords are none the wiser. So that's kind of fun. Another version of fraud I found, but cannot find a lot of backing evidence for, so take this with a grain of salt, is that there's some major like tax evasion going on at the time. Does this surprise anyone? It probably shouldn't. Tax evasion is a super old practice. There's evidence of both taxes and tax evasion, along with this pleasure of taxmen in general, all the way back to ancient Egypt. It should be known that tax evasion in the Middle Ages could obviously face a brutal punishment because it wasn't the Dark Ages. Anyway, I found this example, as most people do, while watching Pawn Stars. Also, can we take a second to talk about how Pawn Stars and Hardcore Pawn aren't fooling anybody with their double entendre names? Anyway, so I was watching an episode of Pawn Stars, and a man brings in a gold bar and marked, whatnot, and it also had like coral buildup on it, indicating that it was from a shipwreck. Expert gets called in, and one of the pawn guys is talking to the expert, and the expert notes that it was marked down in weight. It weighed significantly more than what it was actually marked as, and the expert tells them that this was a common practice back in the day because this was an easy way to claim less on the value of gold and in turn pay less in taxes. Kind of neat. Departing from the anecdotal example from Pawn Stars, I did find one on the Smithsonian Magazine website where they describe the act of fraud by both the receiver of gold coins and also the smiths who made them. They would often reuse old dies, which could result in many misprints, so they're using the same thing to stamp it, essentially. Sometimes the coins would end up with 2 faces, but the common peasant would not know because they couldn't read. Another thing that would happen is that the owner of said gold might just try to bury it somewhere and otherwise avoid spending, reporting it and spending money to have it taxed. Essentially, from the turning of the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, we also have the church being a little more involved in financial crime. How fun. In the 15th century, Pope Alexander VI did some nefarious things to become pope, including bribery. He would also use his influence as pope nefariously, often becoming close with some of the most wealthy kings around him. He would influence and be influenced by them, letting his ill-gotten position get to his head. The power he now wielded also aided him in pursuing women, which is not very pope-like. Hardly the first pope to do this and this sort of things. We can go back to the 11th century to find Pope Benedict IX, who had accepted bribes, and these bribes led to all sorts of different things, including but not limited to him stepping aside as pope so his godfather could take the papacy, whatever, before reclaiming it once again to continue his, fraudulent manner. So, if it all sounds like the TV show The Borgias, I'm not surprised. Jeremy Irons' character of Rodrigo Borgia would become Pope Alexander VI, so makes a lot of sense. The holy man with the big hat was not solely the bearer of these issues. The church in those days would often leverage many fees on the peasants who worshipped there. It was not merely the, basket that's passed around like it is now, as the church was also seen as legal authority outside of the crown itself. There were certain things that the church offered, like trials and the like. The church often employed various methods to extract money from the common people. These included mandatory court fees for services such as serving citations, postponements, dismissals, document duplication. Defendants, whether or not guilty or innocent, were burdened with these costs, which could lead to suspension from the church services or excommunication if unpaid, which was a huge deal back then. Court also allowed defendants to commute their penances for a fee, a widespread practice despite official condemnation. Offenders had to abjure their sins and under threat of heavy fines, which varied based on income or social status. The court offered credit plans for those unable to pay immediately, ensuring eventual collection, but increasing financial strain on the people. Additionally, the court's record-keeping practices involved interlineations and adjustments could lead to inaccuracies and potential manipulations. These practices collectively impose substantial financial burdens on individuals, exploiting their legal and religious vulnerabilities. They had no other choice. Of course, they're not the only ones to do this. The courts and cities and kings all had their ways of squeezing every dollar a person made from them, but whether it was just or not, all of these crimes spanning thousands of years culminated in what the modern white-collar crime is, and one of the most famous of names of financial crimes is Charles Ponzi. His actions in 1920 cemented him in the annals of history as a crook, and his actions may have been replicated many times, or no, not may have, they have been, most notably by one Bernard Madoff, which is also a hilarious money crime name. Like Bernie made off with your money, you know what I'm saying? Like, anyway, even Ponzi, the namesake for the scheme used by both men, wasn't even the first to do this. No, it turns out that before Ponzi was even found responsible for around $15 million of 1920 money, and Bernie Madoff to do the same to the tune of $65 billion. Before all that, someone beat them to the punch. And we know very little about this person, other than the crimes that she committed, and a little bit about her life before. But we do, we kind of know her name. Yeah, that's right. Ladies can steal money too. Sarah Howe worked as a fortune teller in Boston in the late 19th century, specifically in 1877, which is important to note because of where the country was economically and socially. The not-so-Civil War had ended and splintered the nation, but the nation was starting to heal a little bit by this time. In the years after the Civil War, banks began to pop up more and more. This was also the same time that many famous bank robbers were active, like the James Younger Gang, for instance. The National Banking Acts established a national system, and this created a uniform currency for the system to use. As the new changes stabilized the economy and promoted growth, industrial growth also took place, railroads connecting the coasts, as well as establishing faster routes for goods to be shipped. People began to move from their homesteads into the more urban areas. Local economies grew. More places like this began to pop up. New towns, new cities forming all over the place. And as more places like this began to pop up, they needed banks to support them. Banks of all sorts would pop up, and House was no different. She started the Ladies Deposit Company, which aimed to serve women who had no support of their own, essentially women who had no husbands or no living parents or didn't live with their parents anymore. Howe advertised that her bank would be able to generate them money, that if they deposited so much as $100, they could and would see an increase on that $100 to the tune of $96 in a year's time. That's pretty crazy compared to a modern CD. I don't know. It's like 8%, right? But I don't know what the highest CD is right now. I think last time I looked at them, it was like 4, maybe, on a good one. People were stoked about hearing such good news, and there were suspicions, but those were quelled when Miss Howe actually threw in the fact that they could get 3 months advance on their interest. So they got to walk away with 24 brand new dollars, which was nothing to sneeze at back then. All they had to do was deposit that $100. Sounds simple enough. So people bought in. Word spread rapidly in the Boston area, and this fascinating story reached the press, and then word spread even faster. The saintly woman took the money from the most desperate women and promised them profit. It was so secure in the mission that men could not even enter her building. It's a women's only thing. And since she sits in this episode, you know that Sarah Howe deceived these women. She took new investments and used that money to pay her older investors. This is exactly how a Ponzi scheme operates, and for 3 years she had this operation going. The issue with Ponzi schemes, besides them being schemes, is that they rely on the idea that there will always be new investors kind of turning in, which is not how things work, unless you're the government. Anyway, people began to notice odd dealings around the banking, and in general, the local press put out a series on Howe and her bank, This caused a panic, withdrawal, people rushing to take their money out. There was not enough money to go around, and the authorities quickly snatched Howe up. The press and court of public opinion quickly demonized Howe into a monster, which I don't completely disagree with, but she was preying, on vulnerable women and taking often their last dollars. The press, however, believed that in order to comprehend this, general public would need to see her as an actual monster, which is something that is still kind of prevalent today. Of course, no normal woman could trick people. She has to be, and I quote, short, fat, very ugly, and so illiterate and as to be unable to write English sentences or to speak without making a shameful blunders, which I feel like I've made a few today, so I don't know. After being arrested, she stood trial and was sentenced to 3 years' time in prison, and then opened a brand new bank and defrauded more people as soon as she got out, pretty much. Shocker. She had been caught again, but served no additional jail time and returned to her life as a fortune teller. She died in 1892 and left plenty of furious women to remember her. She was not alone, of course. Scammers were rampant in the 19th, 20th century. Immediately, snake oil salesmen come to mind, but there are many people who scammed people over however they could, wherever they could, as often as they could. Just 28 years after Howe passed, Charles Ponzi would run the same scheme, and of course, Bernie Madoff in the 21st century. And this is kind of the end of the financial crimes of the episode. As we encroach on more modern times, the actual white-collar era will unfold, and I think this is a good spot as any to kind of call it. Very interesting, though. A little sad, but not totally surprising that people have been scamming one another forever. What is interesting to me is how far back some of these things go. I mean, I had no idea about some of these systems that were in place, like seeing how some people exploited it. It's pretty fascinating to me. I think that my favorite of this episode is probably the boat guy, Hedgestratus. I don't know, something like that. I forgot his name already, but that plan gone awry is very hilarious to me. As far as like playing the system, definitely the most impressive is the Alcmaeonidae plot, which gave way to, kind of the democratic system of Athens as we know and study today. Like, the whole web is quite tangled, very, very tangled indeed, but it makes for a great story. And how fun of a movie could that be? Like a thriller style movie set in ancient Greece with very little focus on like battles, like typical ancient Greece period pieces do, like just focusing heavily on the drama of the situation. I think it would be awesome, and more importantly, I think it would, it would not be another remake, so that would be nice. It would be a good change of pace. At least I don't think so. There might be a movie about it. I don't know. Either way, I hope it was a welcome episode, and it was a great listener suggestion. Once again, I highly recommend everybody to at least think about a topic you might like covered, or something that might potentially be interesting. I feel like there aren't any bad suggestions. This episode given me a lot of really interesting stories to tell you guys, and I have some other that are coming down the pipe that are also very interesting, that can go a lot of different directions, so very excited about that. If you want to submit a listener suggestion, in the description or in the link tree, which is in the description, you go to or episode suggestions, and you can fill out a little thing and it emails it to me, or you can email me directly, remedioscholar@gmail.com. So yeah, but I'm excited to get back to work on the show. I'm glad to be back. I'm sorry it's been so long, but hopefully everything is smoothly from here. I have so much more free time that I don't even know what to do with all of it. Like, it's great. It's very nice to be done. I'm happy I graduated, and I'm ready to kind of move on to the next stage and everything. But thank you to everyone who has been patiently waiting my return. Thank you to the new people who are listening. Thank you for your support. Don't forget, check out the merch store in the description. You can get a sick Nassau shirt like I'm wearing if you're watching the YouTube video right now. Also in the description is our friends, so check out our friends of the show, the Macabre Emporium, Real Creature Feature, West of Nowhere, and the Dark Windows podcast. I'm adding him in. Very fun stuff. Check all those guys out. Tell them who sent you. Check out the socials. Follow us on Facebook. Go to the Facebook group. And like I said, watch the YouTube video. Pretty cool. just to see my face, if nothing else, or get to see the pictures that I upload to kind of help set the scene. So, anyway, thank you for listening. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Bye!